partners are important for multiple work packages, including Work Package 9. The Work Package 9 really relies on the national assessments, and without these national assessments, we really can't do the work. But we also hope that the policy work would be an interesting experience, a useful experience for the case study partners, and that it might enrich your understanding on what policy processes and policy assessments are about, and how soil science contributes to is very important and contributes to the policy framework for the soil protection, but it's not the only bit. So in addition to soil science, we need other elements as well in order to come up with appropriate policy recommendations. Our thinking for the session today was that while we rely on case study partners, it might be a little bit difficult for case study partners to actually understand what we want from you guys. That the policy assessment might be a bit of an enigmatic part of the project for many of you. So we thought that we would take the opportunity today to explain our approach a little bit more and to give you a flavor for what this work would involve. Okay. So the session today, we structured it so that we have this presentation at most 30 minutes, but hopefully even less. And then we would split up in small groups for 30 minutes, and then we'd be back here for a short recording and discussion period. So in this presentation, I'll first say a little bit about why integrated impact assessment is so important in RECARE, and then give you an overview of what integrated impact assessment approach can look like, and then we'll give an introduction. Prepared an introduction for the small group discussion. So why do we need integrated impact assessment? And it should be IIA, not IAA. So just for that. So Koen on Monday mentioned that RECARE, the soil science part of RECARE, can make an important contribution to policy by identifying the risk areas, so where the problems for soil protection in Europe exist, what the underlying mechanisms are, and what the potential technical measures to address the physical problems are. But that in itself is only one element of what the policymakers require to devise an effective soil protection framework. Human behavior is very complex. There are many factors that influence whether these potential technical measures actually become implemented and taken up by farmers, landowners, other stakeholders. And this is why RECARE transdisciplinary approach also focuses on involving stakeholders in the process, as well as the socioeconomic evaluation methods, in order to figure out, okay, what are actually, from these potential measures, what are the most suitable, cost-effective, feasible measures, but also to understand of those measures, because we already have elements of the soil protection framework in different policies, what of these policies that are already existing, what works well, what doesn't work, where are the problems and where are the incoherencies and gaps. And this is where then the policy evaluation part comes in, where drawing on what's been done, we try and interacting with all these other elements and processes, we then try to identify what are the types of measures, policy instruments. We'll try to keep measures for the technical measures and instruments for the policy measures, although in policy discussions usually we talk about policy measures a lot. But we'll try to stick to instruments for the policy part. So what types of instruments do we need to promote the measures? How should they be designed? What type of support is required? How should they be combined and mixed? And that then together gives us, within RECARE, I think a very solid footing on which we can support the soil policy at EU level and national levels. So this is an idea for how the policy assessment fits. The impact assessment in the I wanted to give you a sense of how it fits within the policy processes. Policies are usually developed in cycles. At EU level, they're developed usually around programming periods. So these are 7-year periods around which EU funding is allocated. And in each policy process, so you have the existing policy that would be up here. And then if integrated impact assessment is done well, it helps us to understand what works, what doesn't work, and why. And the idea with integrated is that it considers the 3 dimensions of sustainability. So it doesn't look just at the environmental, it also looks at the economic, and it looks at the social impacts, costs and benefits of an existing policy instrument or mix of instruments. And the European Commission has been relying in trying to promote science-based policymaking, and evidence-based policymaking has been promoting or requiring the use of impact assessment for the last 5-10 years. There's 2 types of impact assessment. There's the ex ante, which basically the Commission prepares anytime they provide suggestions for policy reform. They have to identify between different policy options what are the likely impacts. In RECARE, though, we're doing an ex post assessment, so we're not looking ahead. So we're looking ahead when we're devising the recommendations, but we're looking at what's been done and what's existing and evaluating that. So this is where what I said yesterday, we're looking at in work package 5, and in the previous other work packages, we're looking at existing but also potential. Whereas in work package 9, we really focus, with the impact assessment, we focus on the existing, but of course we'll consider implications or issues around potential and how those fit in as well. So when we're looking at impacts, then we use different types of indicators to then characterize different types of contributions that policy instruments makes to different policy objectives. Okay, so we're not looking at just soil health. One important element or concept in EU policies has been the idea of green economy and green growth together with resource efficiency, and balanced regional development is another very strong policy objective of the EU. Now, when one of the challenges is then to say, well, we can't just look at one policy instrument in isolation. We need to look through the impact assessment, what are the likely synergies and trade-offs between instruments, as well as what are the barriers and acceptance issues around implementation of instruments. And this then all feeds into and informs the policy process in developing new policies. And then we get a cycle. So then these cycles at EU level usually go on a 7-year periods. There's a number of challenges in conducting impact assessment, and especially integrated impact assessment. Determining the direct and indirect impacts of a particular instrument can be very challenging, and we'll talk about that a bit more later. For us, and I'm sure you'll appreciate this also given the discussions this week, in order to evaluate an impact, you need quantitative, qualitative data, and that's often missing, or it's partial, integrated, tries to get an overall picture. You might only have data for one aspect here and there, so it might end up being really a patchwork where you have to use a lot of expert judgment, where you have to rely on proxy indicators and on qualitative assessments as well. The data collection and monitoring for soil protection in the EU from the policy perspective is very partial. So that's a challenge we'll have to figure out how we deal with. And another challenge with an integrated assessment is that you need to evaluate the interaction of instruments. How does one instrument maybe positively or negatively affect the impact of another instrument? So these are some of the conceptual challenges we'll have to deal with when we're developing the methodology further. In terms of the main steps of integrated impact assessment, so the point today is not to take you through all of these in detail. We'll be developing this over the next year, 2 years, but the idea is to give you a sense of what's involved, and with the exercise that we'll be doing is basically focusing on these first three points. Now the first step is always to identify what are the relevant policy fields and instruments for our assessment. You then need to identify the intervention logic of policy instruments, and we'll say something about this right away. And then you need to identify the impacts that are likely to occur because of the instruments, or that have occurred because of the instruments. Costing, this refers, for example, to how much does it doesn't just refer to the cost that the farmer incurs when they carry out a particular practice. It also refers to how much does the administrative setup cost. You get the sense that a lot of the work will be done by us. We won't say, this is your threat, go and figure out your policy instruments in your country. There's a lot of overview reports already. We have quite a lot of knowledge of what instruments are relevant, not, and what exists. So what Eclologic will do together with you, though, and in collaboration with Work Package 5 and Work Package 4, will identify for all the threats, we'll identify what are already the existing technical measures. And then the idea is to say, okay, some technical measures will be contributing to addressing multiple threats. For example, the cover crops can reduce soil erosion, reduce organic matter loss, also in terms of reducing pesticide use. They help in reducing the need for pesticides. So these will be, this is a multiple threat measure, and it's a key measure. So we'll focus on identifying really the key measures to the extent that this is possible. And then we'll make a clear link then, okay, what policy instruments are currently supporting this measure. On the other hand, there might also be measures that are very specific for a single threat, for example, for contamination, compaction, and because if we just focus on these multiple threats measures, we'll miss out some of these, so we need to make sure we identify those as well. And so through these steps, we'll then come up with the list of instruments that we think need to be prioritized for the national assessment. And the next thing I wanted to talk to you about is the intervention logic. Here I said that an important step is that we identify the intervention logic of policy instruments. This is a very fancy word. One of those EU jargon words, but basically, essentially what it means is that you can link the instrument and its objectives to its impacts. And you do that by first identifying the objectives of the policy and policy instruments. This is the intervention logic for the Common Agricultural Policy, which you're probably all familiar with, at least the name. It's for the next period, so it's for the 2014-2020, And here we can see the general objectives of CAP. So up here you have the viable food production, sustainable management of natural resources, climate action, balanced territorial development. If we go one layer lower, the specific objectives can be divided between the Pillar 1. Pillar 1 of the CAP are the direct payments that farmers get independently of what they farm and how they farm. And these are payments in the form of euros per hectare. In Pillar 2, we have the rural development programs. Okay, so for Pillar 1, there are specific objectives, and for Pillar 2, there's an overall objective, and there's also overlap between the two pillars. And for so these are sort of these objectives set the strategic orientation for CAP. What is the CAP aiming to achieve? And we can link these objectives then through a series of steps. So we have the objectives here: provision of environmental public goods, climate change mitigation, adaptation, innovation, competitiveness, farm income, socioeconomic development. We can link them to the threats and the needs for soil protection. And these steps basically are what the intervention logic is. So we go from the threats. For example, we identify erosion. I didn't write down flooding. I think we forgot to include, and there's one more that we didn't include. Sealing we didn't include, although sealing we didn't include because it's more of an urban issue usually, and the RDP and CAP aren't necessarily the best instruments for this, so that's why it's left out. Basically, for these threats, CAP already, in particular rural development instruments, are already well positioned to address them by providing support for specific technical measures. Okay, so these technical measures, they're just examples of the ones that have already been implemented. Winter plant cover, management of residues, organic farming, mechanical sorry, this is actually shouldn't be here. This goes under regulatory. Sorry, that's a mistake. Promoting irrigation efficiency, so providing funding for improved irrigation systems. And all these measures can be supported through specific instruments within the RDP. The most common one is the agri-environment measure. Climate is being added on for the next period, but in the past it was just agri-environment measure. And this measure basically gives farmers, pays farmers for additional costs or income that they have to forego in carrying out a particular practice. Okay, so they commit for a period of 5 to 7 years, and then every year they get a payment per hectare of land that's involved in the agri-environment measure that offsets their costs. An important other instrument is the use of advisory services, which provides training and support for farmers in implementing these technical measures. A common one that you'll all probably be familiar with is the organic farming one. LEADER is perhaps one you haven't heard of. This basically supports groups in rural areas, provides, it aims to support innovation in rural areas by funding groups and their functioning and identifying local strategies and local approaches for how they deal with their issues. So then when we have the instrument, we have to, in order to get to the objective, we have to link it with the particular outputs. And here we use so-called output indicators. So for example, number of training programs that farmers attend, or number of farmers using improved machinery, area under agroforestry. So these are so basically what results come out of the instrument, and then we link these with the impacts. And this is where soil scientists and the development of possible new indicators then come into play as well. The trick with indicators are that they have to be workable and measurable, and that there has to be a database. So there's actually very few indicators that are available at the moment for measuring impacts, and that's going to be a challenge. So then we have the full circle. We go from the needs measure instrument outputs, impacts to objectives, and this is what enables us to measure the impact of a policy. Now for the discussion today, what we'd like to do is we've divided the threats into groups. We have 5 discussion groups. This one on soil erosion by water and wind and flooding. This will be the discussion will be guided by Jane, and you'll be in here in this room. Yeah, stay in this room. You'll get a flip chart, and then there's guiding questions I'll go through. Okay, and then the others are soil biodiversity, soil organic matter. This will be done by Matt, and we've put the topic leader. So we wanted to make sure that the key expert for the topic is at the table for the particular threat. So you'll see your names here if you can mark them, who goes where. And then the others will, should we just pass them around now? Or at the end? Then we have, the colors correspond to Smarties that are on the table there. So each, depending on what group you want to go to, you take a Smartie based on the colors. And there's a limited number of Smarties, so it'll force you to spread out so that we have each table, each discussion group has enough people. So we have soil erosion, soil biodiversity, soil compaction, and contamination, salinization, desertification, and sealing. We'd like to ask Gundula to do the sealing, to guide the discussion on the sealing group.